Self-Society, it's October 23rd, 2024, and we are only 14 days away from the U.S. presidential election. And this is our 7th projection for that year. Well, for this year, that is. Now, as you've been following me, you know that I'm using a formula that's outside of the polling or outside of guessing games or punditing. I'm basically using real, actual early voting data along with past history voting trends. What do I mean by that? Let's first start by the current voting. You can see here on the NBC News website, they have shown the number of votes that have been cast so far, which there have been 23,621,904 mail-in and early in-person votes cast nationally. Of those, 44% have been Democrat and 38% have been Republican, the remaining 18% being independent. Now you see right below that are a set of states, and you can hover over the state and even click on it to see how many votes have actually been cast in that particular state. For example, in the state of Georgia, 1.930 million votes have been cast up to this date, of which 48% have come from Republicans and 46% from Democrats, and then under the category of others, 6%. So in this video, we're going to be accounting for the votes cast by Republicans and Democrats, and we'll be guessing about where the other votes will be casting toward, whether it be Republican or Democrat. So we'll be going through each of the battleground states to come up with our decision on which states will likely go which way. The other piece of data we'll be using actual real data or the voting habits of the various parties. In this case, the two parties, which include, if you look in 2022, 51% voted in person on election day for Donald Trump, whereas only 34% voted for Joe Biden in person on election day. All the others voted in person early or by mail or absentee. For Trump in 2022, actually he wasn't the candidate then, but his party, those that voted for Donald Trump, 49% voted by mail or absentee or in person early, whereas 65% of Joe Biden's did so. So you can clearly see that the trend usually is that those voting for Trump will show up on election day comparative to Democrats. Now that's been the trend, and ever since Trump's been running for president in the past, I think it was 2 occasions, in 2016 and then 2020. But we don't want to stop right there because every state is different. And furthermore, 2020 is a midterm election, not a presidential election. So we have to take that into account. So I'm using some of the data from election day voting drops while mail voting soars coming from the 538 website, Share of Electorate. You can see that in 1992, roughly 90% voted on election day. And then every election, presidential election thereafter, it dropped by about 5%. Up until 2016, when roughly about 60% voted on election day in person. Now, if we take that into account, 2016 was 8 years ago, so we would expect that roughly 10% less will be voting on election day. So about half will be voting early, either in person, by absentee ballot, or mail-in, and the remaining 50% will be showing up on election day. But we'll be doing our multiplier, in this case, Democrats showing up more so on early voting, and Republicans more likely to show up on election day. Now, because COVID's gone and Donald Trump has been sort of pushing early voting, some of that may change. So I've taken into account all these various different variables and potential changes to come up with what's called a multiplier. So if you take a look here on the left-hand side, you'll see I've listed all what I consider to be battleground states. And they include the state of Texas, Georgia, Arizona, North Carolina, Nevada, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Florida. Now, I understand Texas and Florida are very unlikely to go to Kamala Harris, but I'm including those because there's some rumor, and we want to go ahead and address those rumors that Harris still has a possibility of taking those two states.
So how did we come up with our multiplier? Well, we've taken into account, I'm looking up early voting data for each of the states. For example, in 2022, Texas had 72% show up early. But again, Dems show up early more so than GOP. And I've taken that into account. There is a multiplier that I've used. In this case, roughly 62% of Dems, based on a poll recently done, are expected to show up to vote early. And the remaining 38% will show up on election day. That same poll showed that roughly 49% will be showing up early for GOP and roughly 41% of independents. I believe that's correct. Actually, that should say 51% of independents. All right, sorry about that. So we'll correct that. And now, bearing that in mind, all of our data might change, but we're going to go ahead and add that in. Now, then the remaining, of course, if you take a look at Texas, 44.64 of Dems showing up early, take that away from 100 because of 100% of all votes from Dems, that remains 55.36% of Dems expected to show up on election day. So you can see that the trend is moving toward same-day voting now that COVID's gone. So I've taken all of that into account. And we've also taken into account based on the polling that we talked about. So then we take the number showing up on election day divided by those that voted early, and we come up with a multiplier. And we do the same for GOP and independents. We then take that number and multiply by the number of votes cast by each of the parties, Dem, GOP, and independent. And we come up with the total of the votes that we're expecting each of these parties to receive up to now based on early voting. And then the remaining, we take our multiplier and multiply that number to get how many will likely show up on the same day. So we take 671,000 multiplied by our multiplier for the state of Texas, and we come up with 833,000 votes anticipated if, let's say, that early voting were held, or same-day election were held tomorrow. And so forth for GOP. You can see they get quite a bit more votes because their multiplier is larger, because a larger percentage of them are expected to show up on election day as opposed to showing up early, and independents, so forth and so on. Now, then you add those numbers up for each of the respective parties and the independents, and then I've done also a differential for the total votes expected. About 3% in Dems expected to go over GOP, and about 9% expected to go GOP to go over to Dems. So I've taken roughly 5% of the GOP vote and gave it over to the Dems because 9 minus 3 is 6, and I'm basically error on the side of caution, giving it 5% instead of 6%, and then GOP losing that 5%. And then that's what we're expecting the vote to be with the independents. And also, keep in mind, independents, about 55% of independents tend to vote for Democrats, whereas 45% tend to vote for GOP. And that's been the trend for the last 3 presidential elections. So there's no reason to believe that would change. Now, we're just taking everything based upon what's happened, but I still think that's far better and likely to be far more accurate than using polling, which often is very skewed, and you have various different conflict of interest that are pushing polls out there, whether it be from the left or the right. And then pundits that just sort of guess, they already kind of have in mind who they want to vote for. This is a very neutral way. If you disagree with some of the numbers I'm using, feel free to let me know. Someone already made a comment and I adjusted it according, because there might be something I'm missing in the model. Or if you feel like I'm being unfair one way or the other, feel free to point that out, and I'll definitely consider what you have to contribute. All right, now, having done all that, I'm just going to go through each one of these states and look at the total vote to determine who takes that state based on this model, if the vote or the election were held tomorrow, by the end of tomorrow night. So tomorrow would be our election day, and then everything voted up to now would be the early voting. So let's start with the state of Texas. Now, here you can clearly see GOP is expected to get roughly 600,000 more votes than Dems. So I think Texas at this point is clearly going to go over to
Donald Trump. So it brings the electoral to 232 Kamala, 183 Donald Trump. Let's move to our next state, and I'm just blacking it out here. No, I have to go back. Here we go. I'm just blacking it out here so that we don't get distracted by these other states. Moving on to our next state, and that's the state of Georgia. After all of our multipliers and all of our using our past data, we're seeing that Donald Trump is expected to get about 2.9 million votes to Harris's 2.5 million votes. So roughly $400,000. Excuse me, I can't speak tonight, so apologize. Roughly 400,000 spread. So I think it's clear at this point Donald Trump's going to take the state of Georgia. So that brings it to 232, Kamala Harris, 199, Donald Trump. Now, again, I'm doing a very liberal, leaning it somewhat toward Donald Trump, because I think there's been some shift among the minority populations, the African American, Hispanic to be specific, that's shift toward Trump, and some of the white moving toward Harris than what we've seen in previous elections. But I am giving Donald Trump a little bit of an edge because of that shift, and there's a lot of talk about it, and I just feel I'm just basing up on what I sense from everything I've read and all the data we've seen up to now. Now, moving along and looking at polling, although it's not the primary determinant, I think that Donald Trump is trending upward, and he does tend to do that. So again, I'm basing it on past voting trends, less so from the polling that you're seeing today, although that is one potential factor, but it's very mild at best in this model. But that's why you're seeing such a spread here. But I do think that I'm not necessarily being that gracious toward him, really. So Dems are going to have to really step it up in the states of Georgia and Texas if they want to. They still have time. They've got 13 additional dates to vote, so they need to step it up. All right, now moving on to our next state, and that's the state of Arizona. At this time, there have been a total of 660,000 votes cast, and by the time it's all said and done, by the end of tomorrow, if tomorrow were election day, 1.3 million will be cast toward Harris and 1.5 for Donald Trump. And these are very comfortable spreads for Donald Trump, so he's clearly doing better than he's ever done up to this point, if we're going by this model. And that brings him to 210 to Democrat or Harris's 232. Now, let's move on to our next state, and I'll just comment here in a moment what I was going to say, but let's just move on to the state of North Carolina. And again, I'm just blacking these back out so we don't get distracted. The state of North Carolina so far has cast 1.6 million plus votes, of which, well, again, if the election were held today, we're expecting about 2.5 million to go to Dems and roughly 2.5 million going to GOP. Now, this is very close. And again, I am giving Donald Trump a slight handicap because of past trends shows he does tend to pick up speed as we get closer to election day. And now if that doesn't happen this time, then he may have a chance to make up that difference. But right now, it looks like Harris has a slight lead in North Carolina. And that was different from yesterday's video when it was Donald Trump that had a slight lead. But with the new batch of votes, Harris now has taken the lead. She's at 2.536, whereas Donald's 2.498. So that's a difference of about 37,000 votes. Now, again, there's plenty of time for Donald Trump to make that up. But as it stands right now, it looks like Harris barely scratches by to take North Carolina. And that's a change from yesterday. 248 in the state overall for Harris and 210 for Donald Trump. So this shows you that it makes a big difference. Your vote's going to count, especially this election season, because it's so incredibly close. So if you haven't voted and you want your candidate to win and they're behind, you definitely want to get out. You still have time. All right, now moving on to our next state, and that is the state of Nevada. And in the state of Nevada, so far there have been 320,000 plus votes cast. And after our multiplier, we're expecting 400,000 votes for Harris and 466,000 for Donald Trump. Now, Harris has had a bit of a good day compared to yesterday, because yesterday the spread was almost 150,000. Now it's been shrunk down to 60,000. But as it stands today, Donald Trump's still taking the state of Nevada. With the 6 electoral, brings it 216 to Harris's 248. All right, moving on to our next state, and that's the state of Wisconsin. And here's where I am going to make my comment. But first, let's go ahead and put the numbers in and see who is taking that state. So far, there's been 360,000 votes. And after all of our multipliers, we're expecting 463,000 plus for Harris and 316 for Donald Trump. Now, Donald Trump did catch up a little bit. As of yesterday, that difference was slightly larger, but it was quite slightly larger. But nonetheless, he did pick up a few more votes. But right now, it clearly looks like if the election were held tomorrow, Harris would win the state of Wisconsin. And so that brings her up to 258 to Trump's 216. Now, the other thing you want to bear in mind with these early votes in this model is that we're not looking at what's called geographic distribution of votes. And we really don't have a way of doing that, because there are maps that do show where the counties have voted, but it's the level of granularity that would take me forever to quantify and show you. If I have enough time, as we get closer to election day, perhaps I'll be able to do that. But for right now, it's just not possible, because it's an enormous amount of data. And not just that, but some of the data is very scant in many of the states. But the state of Pennsylvania is a good example of that, because a lot of votes are coming out of the Philadelphia area, skewing it toward Democrats. So bear that in mind when you're looking at this model. All right. And there's just no way to account for that geographical difference at this time. But we would say the geographic distribution is maybe 80 to 90% accurate. We would like it to be closer to 95 plus accurate. So, having said that, let's go ahead and take a look at that state. And we're looking at the state of Michigan before we get to Pennsylvania. And in the state of Michigan, so far there have been 1.164 million votes cast. And after a multiplier, it looks like Harris has a fairly comfortable 350,000 plus lead. And again, we're just basing this up on just the statewide vote. And we don't really know where that's coming out of unless we look at that map that is on another website. I can't remember which one it is. But again, it's the amount of detail that you're really not going to know unless you compare it to the map of 2020. And again, it's a lot of granularity and it would take a lot of time. But as it stands, just in a general sense, right now, the state of Michigan is heavily favoring Harris. Now, that has changed quite drastically, because about 3 days ago, or actually the first video I put out about 7 days ago, about a week ago, Trump had a slight lead. And little by little, more and more votes have been cast toward Harris. So as it stands, there's 273 electoral votes. That's more than enough for Harris to take the White House to Trump's 216. So like I said, she's had a good day. The biggest difference here is being those secting electoral votes coming out of North Carolina that previously was up in the air yesterday, and prior to that, Donald Trump was taking the state of North Carolina. But as it stands today, she has a slight lead in the state of North Carolina, and that may change by tomorrow or the day after, just depending on how the votes go and why you want to go out and vote if you want Trump to win. If you want Harris to win, or you want her to have an even more comfortable lead, then of course you want to go out and vote for her. Now, that's why you want to subscribe. Thumbs up if you like this model, and hit the bell so you'll be reminded of the next video that's coming up. And if I get a lot of good data, then I'll do another video for tomorrow. But I'm not really getting a lot more data. There's no point in just doing, repeating a map that we've already done. All right. Now, moving on to the state of Pennsylvania. And like I said, Pennsylvania is somewhat skewed. When I say somewhat, I'm talking about, I'm not going to put a number on it per se, but I would say fairly. I'm not going to say heavily skewed. But it's not really going to make a difference at this point, because this is the state where Harris and Trump have spent the most money, but Harris has had a tremendous advantage in terms of the amount she's picked up in terms of contributions to her campaign. Now, of course, Trump does have Elon Musk sending him $40 million every month, and a number of other CEOs of big, large corporations. But still, the amount of money that he has, and he's also paying for his fees for his attorneys and things of that nature. Right now, I think because probably Harris is outspending Trump in the state of Pennsylvania, and you have Josh Shapiro who's out campaigning there as well, and he's quite popular in that state. So Pennsylvania so far has cast over 1 million votes, and by the time it's all said and done, we're expecting 4.5 million for Harris and 2.5 million for Donald Trump. And that's because if you look at the state of Pennsylvania, early voting is roughly only about a quarter. So that's quite significant. Even for Democrats, only 16% showed up in 2022 voted early. And the same goes for Donald Trump. But even with that difference, Trump still didn't have enough time to make up the voting differential. So 4.5 million compared to 2.5 million. My guess this is quite off because, again, I think geographically speaking, early voting is not distributed well. I think that the campaigns have really spent a lot of attention in the big suburbs and cities of Philadelphia, and then you're going to see the urban areas come out vote more as we get closer and closer to Election Day. All right, having said that, that means that Harris will pick up those 19 electoral votes, giving her a comfortable 292 to Trump's 216. Now the state that might surprise a lot of people, is it going to go to Harris this time around, is the state of Florida. And so far there have been 2.2 million votes cast, 40% coming from Dem and 40% coming from GOP, 20% independent early. If you look at the state of Florida, roughly 42% of Dem showed up early to vote and 32%. Now that's a spread to 10%. Now, is that going to be enough time for Donald Trump to catch up? Because really this is tied, you see, so there's really no catching up. So the only difference that you're seeing here as to why Trump is taking the state of Florida and by about 120,000 votes, which is not much, is really because, again, Dem show up early more than does GOP. So currently it's tied. And even with the votes of independents likely to go slightly in favor of Harris and some of the GOP, it still is not enough to make up the difference. So as it stands today, the state of Florida is going to Donald Trump. So when it's all said and done, if the election were held tomorrow, by the end of the day, we'd have 292 votes for Harris and 246 for Donald Trump. So quite different from yesterday when Donald Trump was winning, primarily because, Harris was winning with 270, right? And not just that, but a couple days prior to that, Donald Trump was winning. So things have slightly shifted toward Harris. And so what I'm expecting is polling is going to catch up with that. We're going to see over the course of the next couple days. Right now, Donald Trump has been getting an advantage in the polls, to be catching up with Harris. But I think some of this is going to slow down and turn around just a little bit. So look for that in the next couple of days. All right, so that ends this particular projection for today. This is the 7th projection. And again, I'll be doing the next one, number 8, as soon as we get enough new data to really make a difference. But if you don't see one, that means things pretty much are as they are as you see it here. Okay. Be sure to subscribe, thumbs up, and hit that bell. Good day.